Real-Time 1960s presents Evening Report, a complete roundup of today's news with Joe Rubenstein.
Good evening. In Washington, President Kennedy addresses lingering controversy over the Bay of Pigs invasion. In Mississippi, a white student who befriended James Meredith is attacked. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev offers a compromise on nuclear test inspections. The Democrats prepare for 1964. Stanley Kubrick prepares an explosive new film. And Cassius Clay fulfills another prediction. Those are the headlines. The details after this message.
Lark is unique in cigarette filtration. Only in the Keith filter do you find two modern outer filters plus an inner filter of charcoal granules. Science uses charcoal granules to purify water you drink and to purify air you breathe. Lark's granules are not only activated, but fortified a special way. This selective filtration smooths the taste, but doesn't thin out the rich tobacco flavor. You too will find Lark, richly rewarding yet uncommonly smooth.
Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, a leading contender for the 1964 Republican presidential nomination, introduced a resolution yesterday calling for an investigation by the Senate Armed Services Committee of the Bay of Pigs invasion, which he called, quote, a disgraceful chapter in the history of the Kennedy administration, unquote. He said recent interviews given by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy about the invasion had been arranged to whitewash the administration. In the interviews, the Attorney General said no U.S. air support for the invaders had been promised or planned. The suggestion defies belief, Mr. Goldwater said, because any military man with quote-unquote 10 minutes of experience knows that air cover and naval support are essential to a seaborne invasion. At today's press conference, President Kennedy supported the Attorney General's statements and then gave his own version of the events of April 1961.
Yes, there was no United States air cover planned. Obviously, if you're going to have United States air cover, you might as well have a complete United States commitment, which would have meant a full-fledged invasion by the United States. That was not the policy of the United States in April 61. What was talked about was the question of an airstrike on Monday morning by planes which were flown by pilots based in, not in the United States, not American planes. So I think that the confusion comes from the use of the word air cover. You have to talk about the United States air cover as opposed to air cover from which were attached to the brigade, some of which flew from various parts of this continent, not from the United States. As I've said from the beginning, the operation was a failure, and that the responsibility rests with the White House. We engaged in intensive analysis of the reasons for the failure. Afterwards, headed by General Taylor, who's now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Congress, Senate Foreign Relations Committee conducted an investigation, and it seemed to me that the conduct of operations in October 1962 were indicated that a good many lessons had been learned.
Despite the denials by President Kennedy and the Attorney General, Cubans closely involved in the invasion insist that air cover was promised by the U.S. The issue has stirred a good deal of debate in the large Cuban exile community in Miami, and will certainly be an issue in next year's presidential campaign. A white student at the University of Mississippi who had befriended James Meredith, the school's first and only Negro student, said today that someone had poured lighter fluid under his dormitory door last night and set it on fire. The student, Sheldon Stock of Hamilton, Ontario, put out the blaze with no difficulty. Mr. Stock said it was not the first time he had been harassed over his friendship with Mr. Meredith, adding that he will not return to Ole Miss next semester. As for Mr. Meredith, he packed his bags 2 days ago and departed the campus after completing his first and perhaps final semester at the previously all-white institution. Students jeered Mr. Meredith with racist taunts as he departed, and a caravan of 30 cars followed him out of town. Mr. Meredith has said he will not register for a second semester unless changes are made at the school. If Mr. Meredith does want to register for a second semester, he will have to return to the campus by January 31st at the latest. He has promised to make a definitive statement about his plans before that time. President Kennedy, who last autumn committed the full weight of the federal government to integrate the university, was asked today about the possibility that Mr. Meredith may not return.
The federal government has already spent more than $4 million on the enforcement of the desegregation orders at the University of Mississippi. To this point, do you consider that effort worth it? And would you consider it to be an effort that had failed if for some reason Mr. Meredith had to leave the university during this winter?
Well, it's not only $4 million, but it was, of course, 2 people were killed and a good many were wounded. And it was and it's had wide repercussions, and some of them have been unfortunate. However, if the United States government had failed to exert its influence to protect Mr. Meredith, and Mr. Meredith had been denied admission by force, or if he had suffered a physical attack, that would have been far more expensive. And this country, of course, cannot survive if the United States government and the executive branch does not carry out the decisions of the court. It might be a decision in this case which some people may not agree with. The next time it might be another matter, and this government would unravel very fast. So there's no question in my mind that the United States, the executive branch, had to take the action that it did. I'd be sorry if Mr. Meredith leaves. College is difficult enough under any conditions. He's been subjected to a good deal of harassment, and anyone who has been gone through his experience in college would find it difficult to continue. I hope he continues. If he doesn't, that's a loss not only to Mr. Meredith, but I think the University of Mississippi.
On Monday, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy said, even if Mr. Meredith left the university, quote, it would not be a total loss, unquote, because his enrollment had demonstrated that federal law would be enforced. But the Attorney General conceded that Mr. Meredith's withdrawal would be a step backward for integration in the South. On the other hand, he predicted there would be no need for federal forces to enforce a court order for the enrollment of Harvey Gantt at Clemson College later this month. Mr. Gantt would be the first Negro to enroll at the South Carolina institution. I'll have more news for you after this message.
Once a day, really cleanse with Pond's Cold Cream. Pond's removes dirt soap leaves in pores, replaces oil soap has washed away. Now your skin looks radiantly clear, creamy smooth. Once a day, beauty cleanse with Pond's. Pond's Cold Cream.
Here again, Joe Rubenstein.
Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev has agreed to permit 2 or 3 annual on-site inspections in an effort to reach agreement on a treaty with the U.S. and Great Britain banning nuclear tests. Mr. Khrushchev's concession was disclosed today in the simultaneous release in Moscow and Washington of letters between him and President Kennedy. A White House source said today that while Mr. Khrushchev's proposal was still inadequate, it did seem to indicate a serious desire to negotiate. Mr. Khrushchev offered his concession in a letter to President Kennedy dated December 19th. In a reply dated December 28th, the president said he was encouraged by the Soviet proposal, but that 8 or 10 inspections were required. Even so, the president urged immediate resumption of talks on a treaty. These talks are being conducted on the American side by William Foster, director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. This afternoon, the president was asked if he saw Mr. Khrushchev's letter as a hopeful sign.
Yes, the fact that the principle of on-site inspection was accepted was very important, and that's the reason that we are participating in these negotiations at the top level to see if we can make a breakthrough here, because I think a breakthrough would be most important. As there was an earlier reference by Mr. Lissagore to other countries beginning to test, this might have far-reaching repercussions, and therefore we're very interested in keeping them going, to having them be successful, but I think Mr. Foster should determine the American position as time goes on.
Director Stanley Kubrick has signed Sterling Hayden to join the cast of Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. The film, currently being produced in Great Britain, is a black comedy that satirizes nuclear conflict between the Soviet Union and the United States. Today, the 34-year-old director said, quote, I have not worked with Sterling since The Killing, and I'm glad to get him for the part of the psychotic Air Force general who all but blows up the world, unquote. Also in the cast of Dr. Strangelove is George C. Scott, who plays the bombastic General Buck Turgidson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The 35-year-old actor, nominated last year for a supporting actor Oscar for The Hustler, was asked recently about the current upswing in his career.
Well, in a career that has lasted about 14 years, I was fortunate or unfortunate enough not to hit what we call the big time until about 5 years ago. Consequently, I've done about a film a year since that time. Tried to be a little selective and have been very lucky to work with good people in good films.
He was asked if money was a motivating factor when choosing film assignments.
Money means a great deal. Money's a marvelous thing to have. It's a dreadful thing to be without. It's nice to work and get paid a lot for it if you can. It's also nice, if you can, to do things that you ordinarily wouldn't have an opportunity to, perhaps, to do. Certainly, an example, playing before 2,300 people in Central Park, a live audience, under the stars, is an interesting and rewarding experience. I think it's a shame that more actors can't have it.
Finally, Mr. Scott offered a brief assessment of Mr. Kubrick's forthcoming film.
It's a unique film, and one that I think is going to be one of the talked-about pictures, not just of this year, but of many years to come. Controversial and provocative.
Dr. Strangelove should be ready for release at the end of this year. This April, President Kennedy plans to fly to California to inspect military installations and to appear before a Democratic fundraising dinner in Los Angeles. It will be the president's first Western political appearance in advance of the 1964 presidential campaign. In recent weeks, several California Democratic political leaders have visited the president in Washington, assuring him that he is in excellent shape in California. Barring a complete reversal of the current trend, these men said, Mr. Kennedy should win the state's 40 electoral votes next year, no matter the opponent. In 1960, former Vice President Richard M. Nixon won the state by 36,000 votes. In Washington this weekend, Vice President Johnson told a Democratic National Committee luncheon that because of what he called the president's forthright actions in the Cuban crisis last October, quote, "Freedom is stronger everywhere in the world. We have pulled the fangs of the Cuban rattlesnake and made it clear there were no limits to our determination to defend our security," unquote. At the same event, Speaker John McCormick praised the president's New Frontier policies and predicted, quote, "a great 1964 victory with President Kennedy at the head of the ticket," unquote. At today's press conference, the president was asked about a recent proposal made by former President Eisenhower.
You have said that you are in favor of the two-term limit to the office of the presidency. Now, how do you feel about former President Eisenhower's suggestion that the terms of congressmen also be limited?
It's the sort of proposal which I may advance in a post-presidential period, but not right now.
Finally, Mr. Kennedy was asked to address a rumor concerning his Secretary of Defense, Robert S. McNamara.
There have been published reports that some high-placed Republican people have been making overtures to your Secretary of Defense for him to be their 1968 candidate for president. Mr. President, if you thought that Mr. McNamara were seriously considering these overtures, would you continue him in your cabinet?
I have too high regard for him to launch his candidacy right now.
Sports, right after this.
The National Safety Council says, if you don't have seatbelts, get them. If you do have seatbelts, use them. Seatbelts can and do save lives every day.
Buckle up for safety, everybody. Buckle up!
In Pittsburgh tonight, Cassius Clay, heavyweight contender and poetic prognosticator, disposed of 30-year-old Charlie Powell with ease, knocking him out in the third round. In doing so, Clay fulfilled his round prediction for the 13th time in 14 knockouts. After the fight, Teddy Brenner, boxing matchmaker for Madison Square Garden, announced he would sign the third-ranked Clay to a fight with 25-year-old Doug Jones for March 13th. In a recent radio interview, a young fan asked Clay if he tries to knock his man out before the chosen round or if he will deliberately prolong a fight to fulfill his prediction.
I have had a few fights where I predicted 5 rounds and my opponent started to fall in 2, so I had to clinch him and hold him up until the 5th one to make my prediction right. Mr. Moore could have fell in 3, but I had to make it go 4.
But do you always do that to fighters?
Well, I don't always do it. Sometimes I barely can make it work. But I have become so popular at this now until reporters, they don't say, are you going to win? They don't say, how do you feel? Are you confident? They want to know what round am I going to knock him out in. So I must be awful great if they want to know what round am I going to do it in. They don't ask me if I'm going to win or do I think I'm going to win. They all want to know the round. And if I say the round, then they build it up and publicize it. And they're awful serious about it.
Later, Clay was asked by the program's host, Milton Metz, about that future day when he will hang up his gloves for good and retire.
You have thought about it, even though you are only at the...
All right, I always think about it. There's always a younger man to come up better than you, just like I'm coming today. Like I retired Archie Moore, you might say, or I made him look bad. Well, that can happen to me also. But right now, I'm not thinking about it. The main thing now is to invest wisely while it's easy.
Meanwhile, there was agitation this week for the abolition of professional boxing in Illinois. State Senator Paul Simon said a bill would be introduced in the state legislature to outlaw the sport. Mr. Simon, a 34-year-old Democrat representing the 47th District, said medical journals and sports publications had been, quote, increasingly critical of this so-called sport, which has only one purpose, to knock a man senseless. Mr. Simon said he had been reliably informed that since 1953, an average of 9 persons had been killed in the ring each year. And in New York, a joint legislative committee on professional boxing has been examining the fight game following the death last March of Benny Paret after his title bout with Emil Griffith at Madison Square Garden. The committee has been hearing arguments for and against boxing from doctors, clergymen, sports writers, and boxers. Cassius Clay is scheduled to address the committee next month on behalf of professional boxing. And that, for this evening, completes our look at the latest news on this Thursday, January 24th, 1963. Thank you for joining us, and have a great day tomorrow.
This has been your Evening Report, a roundup of the latest news with Joe Rubenstein.